Moonlighter 2: The Endless Vault had a development process that clearly expresses the maturation of the Digital Sun team and their ambition to expand and improve upon the original game's formula. Announced for a 2025 release, the game emerged almost as a necessary breather after the success of the first Moonlighter, released in 2018. The team opted for a more conscious development, starting with a deep analysis of what the first title delivered to players, and listening carefully to community feedback in order to offer a more polished, enriched, and satisfactory experience for existing fans, in addition to attracting new players. The starting point in development was a reflection on what Moonlighter 2 could truly be. Its co-design director, Luis Perez, reported that the initial process was slow, with a lot of experimentation and a lot of internal conversation to establish the pillars that would shape the game. This shows the team's care in not simply replicating the formula, but seeking what would make the sequel unique and meaningful, without losing the practical essence of exploration and management that defines the series. The expectation was to create a product that felt natural, but which also brought innovation and depth and emergent gameplay in combat and commerce. A crucial aspect of this development was the upgrade of the combat systems, which were relatively simple in the first game. Moonlighter 2 introduces a triple layer of combat, including varied weapons, gadgets that allow combined melee and ranged combat, in addition to strategically using the inventory, launching enemies when vulnerable. This decision shows that the team wanted to add complexity and strategy without losing the dynamic pace of combat, which is a considerable challenge in games that mix action and roguelike. The evolution of the shop and the economic system also received a lot of attention in development. The team understood how much the shop management in the first Moonlighter was a strong point and wanted to deepen this mechanic, including customization, decoration, and more detailed negotiations that directly influence the prosperity of the village of Tresna, where the game takes place. This expansion of the title's economic dimension reflects not only the team's vision on what players value, but also a narrative maturation, since the ties between commercial success and the village's evolution are more present and impactful. Another interesting point in the development context was the decision to transition to a 3D environment with procedurally generated maps, bringing greater variability and a renewed sense of exploration. This adds freshness to the sequential experience and demonstrates Digital Sun's commitment to delivering a modernized visual and gameplay experience without losing the charm and identity of the previous work. It is a risky change, but one that can elevate the player's immersion, especially for those who were already used to the 2D perspective of the first. The impression that remains is that Moonlighter 2 worked calmly and intelligently to ensure that the sequel did not sound like a rushed continuation, but rather as a natural and enriched extension of a universe that has already won many hearts. Digital Sun showed maturity in listening to fans, seeking evolution without losing the essence, and bringing not only technical and visual improvements, but also greater complexity and refinement in the game's central systems. Something that is not easy, especially for an originally indie title that gained great notoriety. The gameplay dives headfirst into the roguelike concept, fully embracing that identity much more intensely than the first game. Here, each dungeon run is completely different, with more aggressive and varied procedural generation that changes not only the layouts of the environments, but also the enemies that appear, the available rewards, and even the paths you can choose to explore. This route selection scheme is very reminiscent of Hades, where you see signs indicating what type of room is ahead, whether it's a boss, more treasures, an NPC shop, or upgrades. This gives more control and makes the player think strategically about how to put together the ideal build for each run, instead of simply going through doors without knowing what's coming next. Personally, I think this change is very apt because it puts the player in command of the risk they want to take, making the experience more personal and engaging. The combat system has evolved a lot and is more tactical than ever. You have light attacks, heavy attacks, dodges, and now a long-range weapon that needs to be reloaded through melee blows, creating a natural flow between distance and proximity. This mechanic forces you to get into the fight occasionally, eliminating the possibility of just running away and shooting from afar, which makes everything more dynamic and challenging. Weapons, such as the sword and gauntlets, have completely distinct feelings. The gauntlet is faster and more agile, while the sword is slower, but covers a larger area. In addition, there is an enemy braking system that adds another layer of depth. When you take a specific percentage of their life, they become stunned and can be thrown with the backpack, sending them against walls, traps, or even cliffs. I really liked this mechanic because it transforms the environment into part of the combat strategy, making each room a kind of action puzzle. The bosses are another important highlight of the gameplay, showing how combat has matured since the first game. I took the Herald, one of the first bosses, as an example. He doesn't stop shooting projectiles and lasers, forcing you to seek cover and constantly dodge, in addition to having a sonic barrier that needs to be deactivated before you can attack him. There is another boss who uses powerful wind attacks to push you away, and you need to discover on your own the specific openings and strategies to defeat each one. This variety in attack patterns and the specific mechanics of each boss brings that genuine feeling of accomplishment when you finally figure out how to beat them. Something good roguelikes always deliver with mastery. Now the inventory management part is practically a game within the game, and that is not an exaggeration. Each item you collect has properties that affect adjacent items on the backpack grid. Some increase the value of neighboring items, others can completely destroy what is next to them. This means you cannot simply go around picking up everything you see as in most RPGs. You need to think carefully about organization and strategic combinations. During the dungeons, you are constantly rearranging your inventory as if it were a spatial and economic puzzle at the same time. This mechanic might seem boring on paper, but in practice it adds incredible tension to the runs. Because every decision about what to pick up and where to put it has direct consequences on how much money you will make when you return to the shop. The shop itself has become another complete roguelike, which is one of the most surprising and intelligent evolutions of the game. Instead of trying to guess the ideal price of items like in the first Moonlighter, now you already have an established base price, but you can brutally multiply it through perks, bonuses, charms, decorations, and the combinations you made in the backpack. You use Will's charisma to give that final push in the price during negotiation with customers, and the bonuses accumulate throughout the sales day. A piece of firewood that would be worth peanuts can easily be sold for 1,000 times the original value if you play your cards right. There are even specific objectives like earn 5,000 gold in one day, which transforms selling into something frantic and fun, where you are running around the shop organizing shelves, restocking sold items, and keeping customers satisfied. Honestly, I thought I would prefer the action part, but I ended up getting addicted to this shop mechanic as much as the dungeons. The perk and progression system works similarly to Hades, where you find specific NPCs that offer upgrade choices during runs. These choices directly affect how your build will form, giving the player more agency and decision-making power over the playstyle. You can choose to assemble a build focused on absurd damage and devastating special effects, or you can prioritize getting more chests and more loot to maximize profits in the shop. There are also perks that you specifically choose for the shop phase, which influence prices and sales. This level of customization and experimentation makes each game unique and encourages you to test different strategies, keeping replayability high. The game was clearly designed to be played for much longer and with much more variety than the original. In the end, Moonlighter 2 manages to bring together three distinct experiences: action roguelike, inventory puzzle, and shop management simulator, in a way that makes everything seem cohesive and addictive. The transition to 3D was not just aesthetic. It allowed for more fluid combat, with combos and mechanics that shine more in this isometric perspective. I know that some fans of the first game's pixel art might find it strange, but for me it worked because the changes in gameplay totally justify this visual evolution. Digital Sun has clearly matured as a studio and applied everything it learned in previous projects to this sequel, creating something that respects the original, but is not afraid to be different and more ambitious. It is the type of game that traps you in the just one more run cycle, because both the exploration and the selling parts are equally rewarding, and that is rare to find. Moonlighter 2 tells the story in direct sequence to the first game, but here there is a big difference. Will, the merchant protagonist, loses his original dimension and ends up in Tresna, a distant and unknown land. You start this new journey literally with nothing in your pocket, alongside the other inhabitants of this forgotten village. The mission is clear, but not simple. To rebuild the village's prosperity by transforming your humble shop into the pulsating heart of the local economy. This immediately caught my attention because it brings a feeling of restart and a truly engaging challenge. Escaping that traditional savior-hero script and focusing on a game of patience, strategy, and gradual growth, which for me is something quite comforting and realistic in an RPG narrative. The narrative is much more than just selling items. Moonlighter 2 articulates an intimate relationship between exploration, commerce, and the evolution of the village. You will venture through dynamic and challenging dungeons, always in search of relics and treasures that can be sold to keep your shop running. With each exploration, The game demands caution with greed because dying means losing value in your items, which brings an interesting layer of risk and reward that makes the experience much more tense and meaningful in my opinion. This reminds me of a kind of race against your own ambition, where you need to know when to stop so as not to lose everything. What I particularly highlight in the story is the construction of the village of Tresna as a character in itself. The village is not just a setting. It evolves along with you. As you invest in local commerce and improve your skills, the village prospers, attracting new residents and customers to your shop. I like this because it creates a palpable sense of community and progress, showing that your success is not solitary, but interdependent. For me, this is a very human and emotional touch in the narrative, an invitation to feel that your work there positively impacts the lives of the people who depend on this rebirth. Furthermore, the local residents are lively and charismatic figures, ranging from a vigorous blacksmith to a spirited witch, which brings a special charm to the setting. It is clear that the game wants you to get involved with these people, know their interests and needs, creating relationships that go beyond commerce. This seems like a great way to soften the harshness of the dungeon and commerce challenges, bringing lighter and even funny moments in the narrative, which help build a sense of home in Tresna, something I thought was very well thought out to balance the player's experience. The plot is supported by a gameplay mechanic that reflects this narrative about new beginnings, where Will's backpack becomes a symbol of this adventure. It is in it that you manage the collected treasure, with the possibility of organizing items to unlock special effects and maximize profit. This connection between story and gameplay is something I consider a high point, as each element reinforces the central theme of the game, which is managing your resources well and making intelligent choices to guarantee success. For me, this mechanic reinforces the feeling that every decision counts and gives weight to what happens in the story. The presence of the Endless Vault, a mysterious artifact linked to the game's history and Will's desires, inserts a layer of mystery and additional motivation that I really liked. The idea of completing challenges in the vault to achieve greater goals brings a narrative arc that conveys a sense of continuous purpose. Personally, this reminds me of games that balance action and narrative very well, where the protagonist is always pursuing something that goes beyond survival. In this case, a dream or personal desire that ends up intertwining with the community you are helping to rebuild. The general tone of Moonlighter 2's story is a well-constructed mix of hope, difficulties, and overcoming, with a touch of mysticism from the interdimensional worlds that the game explores. It is a plot that unfolds with subtlety, without rush, letting the player experience both the difficult moments and the small daily achievements. In my view, this calmer approach with a focus on step-by-step growth offers a narrative experience that is safe, emotional, and very engaging, ideal for fans of games who value both the story and strategic gameplay. These aspects together make Moonlighter 2 a story that really attracts me personally. For being more than just a common RPG or a roguelike, it is an adventure about what it means to rebuild something from scratch, manage real challenges with patience and intelligence, and create bonds that give meaning to this journey. It is a type of narrative that seems perfect for those who like something more immersive, strategic, and emotionally rewarding. The story of Will and Tresna has this rare balance of challenge and hope that, for me, is an invitation to play with an attentive heart and mind to what each decision represents. Moonlighter 2 is one of those sequels that decided to make such a radical visual change that it kind of divides fans of the original right away. And look, it's impossible not to talk about it when you see the game for the first time. The developer Digital Sun completely abandoned the charming and detailed pixel art of the first game to adopt a cel-shaded 3D style with an isometric perspective, a transition that is quite reminiscent of what happened with Risk of Rain 2, but here with a visual touch that looks directly at Nintendo's Wind Waker. It's the kind of change you see and think, wow, is this the same game? Because the visual language really changed completely, leaving that nostalgic comfort of two-dimensional graphics for something more modern and three-dimensional that, honestly, will please some and leave others with that feeling of saudade for the previous style. The first visual impression the game gives is of an indie title that wants to stand out for stylization instead of realism. And this is noticeable in every detail of the art direction. The colors remain vibrant, and the chromatic palette tries to maintain the vibe of the original. But now everything has a depth that simply did not exist before. The scenarios are more detailed, more spectacular as the developers themselves like to say, and you can perceive layers in the environments that were previously limited by the nature of pixel art. The dungeon environments now have this feeling of breadth and vertical exploration that 2D could never offer, with elements appearing at different heights and a sense of space that really makes a difference when you are exploring. One thing that caught my attention is how this 3D visual is not just an aesthetic change out of whim, but is completely tied to the combat and gameplay mechanics they wanted to implement. Combat now has more elaborate combos. Will can use a firearm to hit flying enemies, and his backpack has become an attack tool. All of this simply shines more in 3D than it would in pixel art, because the movement is more fluid and the attacks have a different visual weight. The developers were very sincere about this. The pixel perfect of the original was beautiful, but it limited too much what they wanted to do with the gameplay. So this transition to 3D was not just a matter of, let's do something new, but rather a technical necessity to evolve the concept of the game. Now, it is impossible to ignore that this graphical change generated a lot of controversy in the community. And look, I completely understand both sides. The pixel art of the first Moonlighter had a unique charm. It was that visual that embraced you and made you feel at home. Kind of too cozy, and when you compare it with the 3D of the sequel, some people see it as a visual downgrade because it lost that super striking identity. On the Steam forums, you see people openly saying that the game became ugly in comparison, and that it was a shame they abandoned that visual that conquered so many people in the first game. It is understandable because the change was drastic. It was not a refinement, it was a complete revolution in the visual presentation. On the other hand, when you see the game in motion, especially in the most recent gameplay trailers, you can see that 3D has its own personality and can bring details that pixel art did not allow. Will's shop now has objects that pop out with much more presence. The animations of customers with those retro emojis above their heads, which were kept as a tribute to the original, gain a new life. And the dungeon scenarios manage to create more immersive and varied atmospheres. The game seeks that feeling of being timeless and expressive, full of personality even without being realistic, and when it works, it really works well. You feel like you are playing something that has its own identity, even if it is different from its predecessor. Visually speaking, the game was also heavily inspired by Hades. Not only by the isometric perspective, but by this approach of making graphics that are beautiful without needing millions of polygons or ultra-realistic textures. It's that thing. Well-done stylization beats generic realism any day, and the game bets on that with full force. In the end, the graphics of Moonlighter 2 are a risky gamble that divides opinions in a very legitimate way. If you are on the team that loves pixel art and thinks that was the visual heart of the franchise, you will miss it and maybe even turn up your nose initially at this cel-shaded 3D. But if you are willing to give this new artistic direction a chance, you will find a game that is visually competent, full of its own charm, and that uses 3D intelligently to expand the possibilities of gameplay and level design. It is different. Yes, radically different. But it is not inferior. It is just a design choice that serves a greater purpose within the evolution that the developers wanted for the series. And that is something that I respect a lot, even while understanding the nostalgia of those who preferred the previous look. Moonlighter 2 represents an impressive visual evolution compared to the first game, abandoning the 2D pixel art style to adopt a fully 3D isometric visual that brings more depth and vitality to the dungeon and shop scenarios. I personally love how this transforms the experience, making the environments more immersive and dynamic, with fluid animations that bring enemies and collectible items to life. But I confess that it surprised me at first because the retro charm of the original was part of what won me over. The graphical performance on average PCs runs smoothly, supporting resolutions up to 1080p with high settings without problems, thanks to the modest requirements that ask for at least a GTX 1660, which allows me to play on my old setup without sacrificing the beauty of light and particle effects during fights. However, on weaker hardware like the Steam Deck, the game struggles to maintain a constant 60 FPS, dropping to 30 in areas more crowded with enemies, which frustrates me a little because it breaks the rhythm of roguelike runs. The developers seem to have optimized the engine well for HDR and high frame rates on desktops, reaching 120 FPS on recommended configurations with an RTX 3060 Ti, and this makes the details in the treasures and the textures of the village of Tresna shine in a captivating way. For me, this change to 3D elevates the game to a more modern level, but it requires the player to adjust the settings to avoid stuttering and room transitions. Overall, the visuals perform solidly, leaving me excited to dive into the vibrant dimensions without worrying about drastic drops in quality. Speaking specifically about the frame rate, Moonlighter 2 maintains stable performance on consoles like PS5 and Xbox Series X, locking at 60 FPS in most situations, which is perfect for real-time combat and the exploration of infinite dungeons. I consider this a personal victory because, playing on my WAS 5, I feel the responsiveness in the controls improving the timing of dodges and attacks without the lags that tormented demos of similar roguelikes. On PC, with an i5-10400F processor and 16 GB of RAM as recommended, the game reaches between 60 and 90 FPS at 1440p, but on more humble setups like my old Ryzen 5 1600 with RX 580, it runs at 45 and 60 FPS on medium settings, which is still playable, but makes me lower shadows to avoid dips during loot explosions. A more personal opinion. I love how the game supports VSync and customizable FPS limits, allowing me to adjust it for my 75Hz monitor without tearing, making late-night dungeon crawling sessions smoother and less stressful. However, on handhelds like the Steam Deck, the frame rate is the Achilles heel, with drops to 30 FPS and the need for manual adjustments to maintain stability, which discourages me a little from playing on the go. Loading times are a mixed point, with the transition between the shop and the dungeons taking about 10 to 15 seconds on fast SSDs on PC, which is not bad but seems longer than expected for a modern indie game. Overall, the performance wins me over with its accessibility and fluidity on standard hardware, allowing me to dive into Will's double life without constant frustrations. But the vestiges of problems leave me cautious for long runs. I love how 60 FPS on consoles elevate combat, making dodges and backpack swing attacks a delight, and on PC, the scalability makes me feel like the game was made for me, a fan of retro indies with a modest setup. The long loadings are my biggest personal complaint, stealing the hype post-loot, but it compensates with 3D visuals that shine in HDR, immersing me in the dimensions like never before. For handhelds, it is mediocre, and I expected more from the Steam Deck, but overall it is a solid performance that supports the addictive loop without stealing the show. As someone who plays to relax at night, I appreciate the absence of extreme overloads, running smoothly on 16 GB of RAM without lags. If the devs continue optimizing, it will be a 10 in performance. For now it's an 8, with potential to shine brighter. If you are a fan of the first game and have a lot of patience to deal with some imperfections and subsequent updates, you can enjoy the launch without problems. However, if you prefer more polished and stable experiences from the beginning, it might be better to wait for a more refined release or for the first updates that improve performance and fix bugs. Moonlighter 2 is recommended for players who like games that mix action and roguelike RPG with management simulation elements. The lightness in combat, with simple attacks and a relaxed pace, makes it ideal for those who want gameplay that is not stressful, but which still offers strategic decisions, especially in the shop part. It is also for those who enjoy investing time, organizing their inventory, and perfecting the efficiency of their merchandise, with a focus that goes beyond simple combat to something more contemplative and economic. If you are a fan of those exploration games with high challenge and complex combat, Moonlighter 2 may seem too basic. The combat is simple, and the game does not propose to be a frantic hack and slash, but rather an experience that mixes the relaxing with the strategic. In other words, for those who enjoy a more casual gameplay but linked to the construction of a fun and rewarding game routine, it fits very well. The setting is also charming with art and soundtrack that help create the atmosphere. Moonlighter 2 will be on Xbox Game Pass on the launch day, which is great news for those who have a subscription and want to try the game without committing to a direct purchase at launch. This reinforces the idea that you can wait a little and enjoy the game within the service, which can be a good alternative to reduce the risks of a launch with possible initial instabilities. This game profile appeals to me because it unites that feeling of nostalgia for RPGs and roguelikes, but with a modern take and an interesting focus on economy and interaction with NPC buyers, which adds a unique flavor. My personal recommendation is to give it a chance, but calmly. Do not expect a revolutionary game, but rather a title that delivers a fun and charming experience, especially if you like games that combine exploration, simple combat, and management elements. For those who come from the first Moonlighter and like the proposal, or for those who look for games with a less frantic and more strategic and social rhythm, Moonlighter 2 is a treat. Well, that was my analysis. I hope you liked it and see you next time.